There is no good way to have the camera once you're over a certain age. Um, Yesterday, I've taken a few takes um, trying to explore this issue of entitlement with violence, and couldn't quite get to what I wanted to say. And then this morning on the new or in one of the news things, there's a report of a sentencing outcome for an 18-year-old man. He was found guilty of rape of four different 15-year-old women. Now, the judge, the Crown prosecutor, and the defence lawyer all agree that this young man should not be imprisoned. And so he's ended up with a less than 2 year home detention sentence. Now, there's another young man uh, in the 2000s who also um, was found guilty of rape and received a home detention sentence. And he then went on to reoffend, and I think he was still on that home detention sentence, or maybe he had finished it. But the point is, it doesn't that approach does not work for a group of privileged young people. Well, not necessarily young people, privileged people. When I say privileged, these are people who, from an early age, never received any no, so they're given whatever they wanted, allowed to do whatever they wanted, and maybe the parents may have tried to remonstrate with the child, but the tantrums or the consequences were too much and they stopped. And so this child's grown into an adult who basically takes what they want, doesn't understand no, or if they receive a no, um, uh, impose their will on someone else. And in this case, four separate 15-year-old girls were raped by this boy. Well, he's not really a boy. If he's 18, he's old enough to vote. He's old enough to make his own choices. And even though these rapes happened when he was 16, um, uh, to me, we're simply reinforcing poor parenting, lack of boundaries. And so, what I really wanted to talk about with entitlement is that this type of behaviour is the hardest really to rehabilitate. Um, People who have a trauma background have a lot of difficulty managing emotions um, because there's a trauma trigger, so their limbic system gets into operation before they can really make good decisions. Um, they they can be rehabilitated reasonably easily, um, but I I would suggest best done in a contained environment. Entitled people, um, from particularly those from a privileged background, are much harder to work with. Um, and I think depriving them of liberty is a good start. Whereas depriving the other group of their liberty under the guise of safety, sometimes it is safety and it's necessary, but it adds to a traumatic load, not just for them but for the whānau. And I think understanding the difference, being able to spot the difference from the way people talk, the way they explain about their backgrounds. There's a whole lot of very subtle non-verbal cues to look out for. And probation officers used to write very detailed backgrounds which would give the judge more information about the early beginnings of this behaviour, or these why this person might be presenting in this way. But about 2008, 2010, the judiciary asked for the background sections of probation reports to be cut right down to a couple of paragraphs. And so they are sentencing people, particularly in the district court, with a much shorter background than what used to historically be the case. I would argue that that is one of the factors that we are seeing in higher re-imprisonment and reoffending rates, is that we are not really understanding the true genesis of the violence. And they're not discrete categories either. So someone with a trauma background can also have some entitlement behaviours, but understanding when those might come out and when the trauma is operating. So there's one other aspect to this which I think is important to consider, is actually the legislation that we currently have and how that reflects human rights and how that works in operation, and how cases are ranked in severity. Because what we have is that someone who commits fraud will receive a prison sentence, even though they might not be a risk to the community. They'll receive a prison sentence greater than 2 years, and you've got this young man who has physically and sexually harmed these 4 women, who will carry that trauma and possibly, unless that's well processed with them, carry that in their relationships with their children, with the people around them. And he is able to have a sentence less than 2 years. When I was working as a probation officer, this standard sentence for male assaults female in a domestic violence situation was 6 months imprisonment. In that time, those people were not eligible to do any programs any rehabilitative programs in corrections. And common assault attracted a much longer sentence. So, what that seems to say is that we don't value women in an intimate relationship as highly as we do strangers. And, we could possibly say we actually don't value women, and it shows in this crimes legislation. I I also think um, there is something to be explored about when you are someone with power and privilege in society, that you are able to put pressure on people in the judicial system. And we know that from Coral Shore being able to get the police to delete certain um, aspects of her husband's evidence from a police interrogation, and to ensure that the police dropped charges against this young man that her husband had invited home for a cup of tea. It, you know, that is not a just system when someone's rank and privilege can affect the judicial outcome through the justice system, police, probation, law, the sentencing. That is not justice. That is corruption and nepotism. And we're at a time in the world where we need to consider how much this is operating, not just in the criminal law system, but in the civil law, in the way that property owners have influenced the legislation so that now tenants of both residential and commercial properties are disadvantaged by legislation, and it is not considered under ordinary contract law as that a breach by either side is considered equivalent. There's more power to the property owner, who ultimately has privilege. Anyway, some food for thought in considering uh, both how we perceive violence, how we assess violence, and then how we treat it. And yes, for you to take this into your own countries, your own communities, and to look at what is actually going on.